Ravi, before you rush away, just quickly, a very big thank you to Ravi, because he was the man who who put me into translation. In fact, I went to him saying, here's this absolutely wonderful medieval text I've just read. Why doesn't anyone translate it? So he says, well, why don't you? I said, me? I don't know enough. He said, no, but you read the original. You can tell me about it, so you can translate it. So that's how I got into it. So thank you, Ravi. That always remains. That was a long time ago, about 13 years ago, and spawned very quickly, because I had replied to that, to what Ross said, a little bit to what Renuka said, and Trisha there, about the landscape. I've been around in writing and in translating now for almost 2 decades, and I think things have improved enormously. When I started, the best hope you had to get published were these small, closely held family companies. They gave you no rights, they gave you no royalties. You were just thrown in the dark, and you would just keep your fingers crossed and hope that you would get something. That has completely changed. I mean, not entirely, but to a great extent. What I really feel, and that's taking off from what Ross said, that instead of whinging and whining, we need to do something, we need to take a step, and we need to stand up and speak for ourselves. About 12 years ago, a group of us got together, a group of writers, translators, and we said that we need to organize and talk to each other and help each other as a community. That community today has grown. We're about 170 of us, and we're completely voluntary, we help each other, and it is astonishing to me, even today, how many writers, not just new writers, but established writers come and they don't know anything about copyright law, they don't know anything about their own rights, they don't know what the contracts are, they don't know when they're being taken for a ride. They are so lost, and that's what we really, really need in India. We need a platform where writers have a voice. And just to let all of you know, we've started that. It exists. It's completely voluntary right now, but it's happening. So there is hope. It's not so bleak. That's all I want to really quickly say. I won't dwell on my work. There's not much time, and I'd rather other people make more valuable statements.
Thank you, Ronnie. Can we go to Mahesh, please? Yeah, I know we've been waiting a long time.
Oh yeah, but it's
I'd like to hear about
a pleasure to be here. I'm not a translator, so it is very interesting to listen to what you have to say about the subject. I guess I'm here because I'm the director of NORLA. It's an organization, it stands for Norwegian Literature Abroad. So we are a governmental funded organization to promote Norwegian literature all over the world. And one very, very important part of our task is to work closely with the translators. So we have experience in working with translators from Norwegian to languages all over the world. I very much support the perspective from Ross Schwartz about the active role of the translator, how important it is. And also I like very much also the questions in the topic for this conversation, if translators can give the depth to literature and culture, and what kind of role they have in bringing stories. I think both answers are very positive for the translators, because we see them in NORLA as ambassadors for us, for Norwegian literature. Norwegian language is a small language compared to what you are experienced in, so it's very important to have translators to bring our literature out. And I will be very short just to say that we do this in many ways. We give we motivate translators, we give them knowledge, we arrange seminars, scholarships, travel subsidy to come to Norway to learn about Norwegian nature and meet authors. And the meeting part is very important to build active translators. We have to facilitate meetings between translators, publishers from Norway, from abroad, to make these key people come together, talk about literature, then the books can travel and the translators can build up their good way of working. I also just add the fact that this organization I represent is funded by the government. It doesn't mean that we decide what books to translate or how things should be done. We very much work in companion with foreign publishers, and it's their wish, their demands, what kind of books they want, the advices from the translators that makes the basis for what books will travel. So this is also an important part of our work. In Norway we have the, as Rose Schwartz also mentioned, a purchasing system for books into to Norway from foreign languages. It's very important. We also have it for Norwegian books, so fiction titles, non-fiction titles and children's books, they written of Norwegian authors, they are also bought by the state and spread out to the libraries. And for a small language community to have this system over the decades, it has given us great results. We have Norwegian authors who are world authors now, with a lot of great names out in the world. And also when you see the other part of Nordla's work, the translation subsidy is also very important. So last year Nordla supported more than 600 books into 44 languages, and that's quite a high number for a population of 5 million people. So we have a lot of good writers. The translators, again, are the most important partners for Nordla, and I cannot stress it enough how important it is to always have motivated translators to make the bridge between countries and between languages. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Larry.
Just very quickly to say something about that. When translators get together in the UK, one of the things that we do find ourselves comparing is how well we are supported by the national organisations that promote the literatures from which we translate. And we are all very jealous of the Norwegian translators. I should say this, there was recently a seminar for kind of all the Nordic language translators in the UK, and all of us who do not translate from Norwegian just sitting around seething with jealousy at the kind of support they get. For people who want to understand the best way of promoting the kind of literature of a particular country, we always recommend, look at what the Norwegians do, look at what the Danes do, look at what the Dutch do. I annoyingly translate from none of those languages, and I'm deeply resentful. And nothing you have said today has made me less resentful. So, I mean, thank you.
Yes, but before we move on to, I'd like to ask Olga, but I must speak for Indian translators. I don't think we'll recover from the emotional shocks of this conversation. I'm definitely
PTSD after.
Yes, I'm definitely going to have PTSD.
Yeah. Well,
That's
we're trying to, right? We're trying to.
Okay, I was starting to feel that, as we were talking initially, that this was going to be a whining session. People were kind of like, oh, translations have it so hard. And I was starting to feel, I'm so ignorant, I'm so optimistic. I feel like, cases like this Polish woman wrote Flights, I mean, that's her big thing. Yeah, I see her posing with her translator hand in hand with the trophy, International Booker Prize. The Elena Ferrante thing. I mean, for European languages, it seems to be happening now. People are aware. Oh, I imagine this is a poor translation. People are talking like that. It wasn't like that many years ago. So that's one thing I thought, to have the optimism of crazy people, ignorant people, or people who are drunk. But I see that lots of people share this optimism that things are slowly changing. English as the language, the people language, the middle man, is also changing. We're talking about, Marathi, Bangla, all these languages getting translated because educated Indians, in this case, Indians who have traveled, also who have listened and been keen on getting the other language right, can go back to their native language, their internal language, and put these two souls together and work it out without having to go through, remember, what is it called in English, the telephone? That you tell someone something, and then as children you played it, and by the end of the round, Chinese whispers. Thank you. I was asking my husband this morning, he said, something about the telephone. Yeah, it's teléfono descompuesto in Spanish, the broken telephone, the malfunctioning phone. So there's no such, play, and we know whenever English is involved, there could be something totally different happening. What I was thinking is that there's one player missing here, and it's we have people in academia who are doing a great job teaching, I'm pretty proud of that. I think there's a lot published online for free. I'm reading these wonderful writers that would be impossible for me to even know about if it weren't for the internet. Just a silly search will give you, again, Norwegian, Polish writers that you find in English. And I'm very grateful for those people who freely share this wonderful resource. Otherwise, again, it would be the risk. We don't know, nobody's publishing a paper because we don't know how good they are. So there are all these things you just, I'm sorry, I'm totally monopolizing this phone, but this one. It's the phone. It's really stimulating to get translation, over-educated people talking to us, sharing, the struggles, and also the great news. I mean, just amazing. I did take a picture of the final slide you had, because those are, again, ways of continuing the conversation after this ended. So I'm very grateful to your keynote. And is this the votes of thanks? I've lived in India for 11 years, so I guess I'm prone to start catching up on some of the formalities too. Okay, I'm very sorry, but I guess that could be a question. How do we know readerships in this time when there's so much anonymity? I'm hiding in this beautiful Latvian Delhi mansion, in this small room, reading things that are written by people who have very different life experiences. I'm 53, but I imagine someone who's 17 could be doing something very similar. So how do you know who reads what?
I'm sorry to break in, but we have to give the others a chance to
I'm very sorry.
Yeah, so
Well,
sorry
maybe
about that.
somebody else wants to answer that question.
Well, maybe later we can carry on the conversation offline. But we'd like to hear from Shahnaz because she's done a most remarkable thing. Her first translation has won 2 prizes back to back. One going up against India and one for translation.
I'm going to start talking so that I don't know when to stop praising. Well, it's really wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful to listen to everything that has been said here, because my career in translation is pretty recent, and all these magnificent lessons gleaned from long careers, not just in translation, but also in translation activism. I feel like I just did a mini course in that. So thank you for that. And I'm very conscious that I have benefited so much from all this hard work that people in the room have done. And, for instance, I did the Sangam House residency last year, and it was absolutely transforming as an experience for me I spent a weekend, it was a long weekend workshop with well, it was supposed to be one writing mentor, but it turned out there were 3 great translators at least there. So it was just wonderful to be in conversation with those translators, to know that I'm not alone with many of the translation dilemmas that were sort of floating around in my brain. And of course, financially, to be supported, to come there, to take time away from the rest of your life, to spend time thinking about translation. So it has definitely been a huge part, a huge role in my growth as a translator. So, things like that kind of activism that led to Sangam House, or the kind of activism that led to something like the JCB Prize, treating original works and works of translation on the same par. I'm aware that a lot of work has gone into those kind of, or even what Ravi Dayal said about how translators and authors getting paid 50-50 each, which is a huge jump from, say, 25-75. So I feel that I've benefited a lot from all your work here. And the other thing that, there's so much to be said, but one thing that struck me was a lot of people talked about, speaking about the Norwegian experience or the French experience, about professional associations for translators. And I would love to hear from other Indian translators about, and Rohini started talking about this, about what is already on the ground as to professional associations for Indian translators, because it seems to me a really sort of high reward but maybe low expense way of becoming more proactive with getting translation activism out there. So I'd love to hear about what kind of efforts are already underway. And I think, Daniel, you mentioned how each country has its own sort of translation ecosystem, and in India it's almost as if each language has its own. So we're talking about maybe multiple associations, perhaps multiple ecosystems, and maybe a way of creating a network between different linguistic associations for translators. So if anyone has anything to say, and I know we're running out of time very soon. Oh, good, yes, please.
Yeah, sure. Jenny, yes.
So yeah, is Rahul Soni still here? No. Well, I nearly stopped my translation work before I even got started, and the reason being exactly what the problems that some of the folks have mentioned here, Ranjita, Kalyan, and Priya, and maybe Shahaz. India does have a very difficult translation ecosystem, and things about, as Rohini was saying, copyright aspects, and how to even get a query letter out to a publisher. All of these things are, you just have to kind of cobble your way through. And so what I started, was it late last year, I floated the idea, because I follow people like Daniel and Joanne Harris and a whole bunch of British authors on Twitter, and absolutely jealous of all the work that Society of Authors in the UK has been doing, of which you've been a big part. And so we sort of floated an idea, as Kalyan and Arunava know, of a Writers and Translators Association for India. I wasn't aware of what Rohini just mentioned, and I will follow up with her on that, because that seems to have been a well-kept secret, at least to the 170 people, and not beyond that. But I floated this idea, and I wrote an article on Scroll, and on Twitter I got a lot of good responses, and then all of a sudden everything just went dead quiet. And I think part of the reason is that the Indian publishing ecosystem is still fairly small, and people are afraid. People are afraid because they think if they join some kind of public association, it might jeopardize maybe some of their relationships within the Indian publishing. Right, you know what I'm talking about. Those of you who've been a long time within the industry, it's very incestuous and it's cliquey, and so people are afraid, and I'm not. And so I've been speaking out, and I'm still trying to get momentum behind this. For, as you say, rather than a regional ecosystems, we want one, so that we can come together and, as you said, take the power. And not just power, but I think there is so much in terms of resources, in terms of know-how, that we all need to share if we're going to do something with, moving our translation work forward. And so I do think, and we have a lot to learn from. We've got AWP in the US, of which I'm a member. We've got, Alta, the American Literary Translators Association. We've got the Writers' Trust in Canada. We've got Society of Authors. So there's a lot of good practices already out there. And obviously learned a whole lot more today about France and the Norwegian folks. And so I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good stuff we can take on board and start running with, of course, adapting it to our needs. But I think what's needed is, as we go away from roundtables and discussions like this, is to really, especially for our Indian folks, is to continue to stay in touch and to continue to build momentum and move that forward. Because as I say, I mean, I got a whole lot of response, as Arunava knows as well, and then all of a sudden everything just went dead quiet. And so I'd like to keep that going, and I was hoping to use this as a way to let people know. So anyway, that's that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Can we hear quickly from Saket, and then from, I know Ross has something to say, but Renuka, would you like to take it on after Saket, and then Manisha? Yes. All very quickly, please. As you know, we've already overshot our time. Luckily, it's raining, so
Sure. Thank you, Arunava, and good evening to the panel. I'm not a translator and I'm not in any way closely related to the translation process, but I'm a journalist who's just beginning to grow his interest in reading translated works rather than translating. So I'll just try and say my perspective from the other end of the aisle. For me, translation has largely been a lived experience in the sense that I was born in a family where Maghi was the predominant language, but at a very young age I started living with my maternal grandfather where Mathili was the language, and then at about 7 years of age I was sent to Darjeeling to study in a boarding school where Nepali was the predominant language in the area. Now again, in the school I had all the friends from different parts of India and abroad who spoke different languages. So English naturally became the only language that we could all come and talk to. I mean, we could all communicate with each other in, and I think it is very much same with the translation. So it may be the case that you cannot find a translator to translate something directly from Gujarati to Nepali, but if you can get the text from one language translated into English, then it is very likely you'll find a translator who can translate it to the other language. And I was living with this notion, but I was recently proven wrong because very recently I traveled down to Tamil Nadu for a project that I'm still working on, to interview a Tamil author, to interview a noted Tamil author. But the problem here was that I did not know Tamil and the author concerned did not know English. And we somehow managed to find a translator, but the translator did not know English. So the translator translated into Hindi, and it was naturally deciphered into English in my mind. But even when the translator was translating what the author was telling right in front of my eyes, I could make out that there is a lot that is being lost in that, in that process of coming from Tamil to Hindi and then to English. So finally I managed a fellow author pointed me to Neeta Gupta, and then she pointed me to an author who had actually read the author, the subject author concerned. It did incur a good cost, a significant cost, and it did take a lot of time. But that is where we need to understand that if you want quality translation, you'll need to pay them well, and you'll also need to give them time. If we just keep on hurrying that we need by this period of time and we can only pay you this much, I think that is not going to work. And lastly, I would like to agree with what Mr. Raman said, that when you are looking at a translated book, you need to look at it as a separate body of work rather than it being translated. For example, the latest book that I am reading is There's Gunpowder in the Air, which has been translated by Arunava. Now I am reading that for the simple reason that I cannot read Bengali, and I found 22 languages. The translator has not been recognized in any. So I would like to end, and I'm sure the panel will say more on it.
Thank you. Renuka, Manisha, and
I'd
then...
like to say one word
Yes,
very
yes.
quickly. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think, thank goodness, some of the publishers in France may read books in English to choose them, but a lot of them do return to the original language to have them translated. But I also think it's therefore fundamental that when we're translating into English or into any language, that we do a really good job, because we could kill a book or we could make a book work. And I think part of the translation process is being really, really good at your target language. And I think we often have a problem with that here. Having just read books for a prize, I think we really need to be concerned with our target language skills. And unless they're good enough, we're going to kill many books, and it would just be a pity. So, and I think paying translators well is fundamental, because if we're not paid, we don't have time to work, we don't have time to do research, we need to earn our livings. I think it's a job, and I think in some ways you become a better translator when you translate regularly, and you see yourself as a professional, and you can take pride in your profession. And I think that's really something that needs to change.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've been a translator of fiction out of interest, but my entire publishing career with children's publishing has been based on multilingual translation skills, and basically managing the whole idea that if you have to have enough children's content in Indian languages, you have to depend on translations. I worked for a not-for-profit for a long time with the belief that all children in different languages, different mother languages in India should have literature in their languages, and that was only possible through the act of translation. So when I work as a translator of literary fiction from Hindi into English, I find that a very solitary exercise. I didn't know about all these translator bodies or these voluntary coming together or of people and so on. But as a publisher, when I work in multilingual children's publishing, we have tried to have translator communities at least talk to each other and peer educate and look at the whole business of how you have to translate for children. Especially when you're looking at texts which they're going to be reading for the first time, and they may have originated in any language at all. It could be English, it could be Hindi, it could be Marathi, it could be Kannada. And when you're introducing children to a language, or you're introducing literatures of that language to children who've just begun to read, how do you translate for that? How do you look at issues of language purity? How do you look at issues of fun? How do you look at issues of fluency? And so on. So I have sort of engaged with all of that, but it's a sort of continuous ongoing process, and I really don't know how quickly we can educate ourselves. I'm really an example of learning by doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we started with Roz and we're going to end with Roz.
I just wanted to say a couple of brief words. I've listened with great interest to all the panelists, and it seems that there are two things that are emerging here. One is the enormous need to be organised in associations, and I think it's important to have associations that are language-based, but also pan-Indian. We have in Europe, we have an organisation called the European Council of Literary Translators Associations that brings together all the different European associations, and we learn from each other's contracts, etc. So the council meets once a year. They exchange information, ideas, and that's been a very useful source of not reinventing the wheel. And the other thing that I need to mention is the F word, funding. That has come up again and again. And I mean, when we look at what gets translated and what doesn't, what gets translated is very often where there is funding, government funding. So that's why there is this enormous discrepancy about which books get translated. There are some countries that really put a lot of resources into having their literature translated. I mean, we've mentioned the Norwegians, the Dutch, the French, and in a sustained way, and into training as well. And so I think the first job for the associations is to really lobby for funding. And I like the way the Norwegians put it in terms of citizens' rights. And I think perhaps rather than saying, literature's a great thing, it should be funded, to say citizens have a right to read world literature in their language. Yeah, and that's perhaps a way of looking at getting government funding. because otherwise there's always going to be this inequality between what gets translated and what doesn't. And you know, as you said, Renuka, for translators to be properly paid, for it to be seen as a profession, to have quality, it's a sort of circle, it's all interrelated. So good luck with all your associations, and we're all happy to help.
Thank you. Unbelievably, we could still have gone on for another couple of hours, I think, and learned a lot more. But we will have to call it a day. So thank you, everyone. Thanks very much. And I'd just like to say that maybe we should end this session with a clarion call for India to get its own translation press, many translation presses, because that is really what has set it on fire in the UK and now in the US as well. So maybe that's where the, Kalpana, I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
That's where maybe the future lies for us. Thank you all very much. And does JBM have an announcement to make, or can we all go home? Thank you. No, but you're going to do this thing. Yes.
Yeah,
No, don't anybody leave, please.